Dorian Reddick grabbed a Billionaire's coffee and poured it on the floor. Travis County Bailiff. Glassfront Café. A room full of witnesses. Harlan Wexley, whose name sat on hospital wings and scholarship funds, stood there with his mouth open and his status suddenly useless. The cup smelled chemical underneath the espresso. Thin. Metallic. A smell Dorian knew from a different life, when a state agency paid him to know it. 2 miles away, a TCQ inspector was already in the ER, collapsed at home, exposure suspected, never made it to his car. The cafe was the noise. The inspector was the target. And the cup logged as evidence? Wrong size entirely. Harlan's order was a large. What sat in that evidence bag was a medium, placed at his table deliberately, because his name pulled a response, and that response was the point. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe. The same system that quietly dismantled Dorian's career once has other names on its list, and this time someone left a paper trail. What Dorian was carrying in his shirt pocket that morning is the reason any of this ever saw daylight. He broke the chain of custody seal on a state inspection order himself, Dorian Reddick said, loud enough that the Travis County Bailiff station near the entrance of Café Medrano on East 6th Street looked up from his radio, and now he wants to know why a grown man poured his coffee on the floor. The coffee was already there, dark and spreading across the tile, curling toward the baseboard like it had somewhere urgent to be. The paper cup sat on its side near the chair, still leaking at the seam, and the room had gone the particular kind of quiet that only arrives when something irreversible has happened in a place where irreversible things aren't supposed to happen. The espresso machine hissed once behind the counter and then fell silent, as if the cafe itself had decided to listen. Harlan Wexley's face held a shape that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to rearrangement, the expression of a man whose morning had just been grabbed by the collar. His name sat on the children's wing at St. David's Medical Center 2 miles north and on 3 scholarship endowments at UT Austin, and he occupied space the way powerful men do, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never needed to raise his volume to be heard. He looked at the spilled coffee, then at the barista gripping a fistful of paper towels she hadn't moved to use, then back at Dorian, the way a man looks at a stain he fully intends to have removed. "Who let you in here?" he said, voice cold and controlled. "You want attention? You picked the wrong table." His assistant, Vivian, already had her tablet up, murmuring something to building management without being asked. But Dorian wasn't performing. There was drywall dust pressed into the creases of his knuckles and a child's school lanyard clipped to the zipper of the backpack sitting at his feet, and his eyes carried the particular focus that doesn't come from anger. It comes from knowing something the room doesn't yet know. His right hand moved briefly to his shirt pocket, a quiet check, the way a man confirms something important is still where he left it, then dropped back to his side. The bailiff stepped forward, one hand hovering near his belt, not threatening yet, but preparing. "Sir," he said to Dorian, voice trained to sand the edges off a situation, "you need to step back." Dorian didn't move. The smell coming off the overturned cup had kept him from stepping back the moment he crossed the threshold. Not the dark roast, not the steamed milk, but something underneath both of them, thin and chemical, faintly metallic, a sharpness that had no business being inside an espresso blend, and that Dorian's nose recognized from a different chapter of his life, when people still called him by his last name and meant it as respect. Harlan leaned forward, dropping his voice to the register men use when they want to humiliate without technically raising their hand. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, "and you are about to make your life considerably worse in front of your child." Then he straightened and let his voice open up for the room, smooth, unhurried, shaped for an audience. "This is what desperation looks like. Somebody get him out of here. Subscribe before silence costs someone like Dorian everything, because what happens next is the part nobody was supposed to see." The couple near the window discovered a sudden deep interest in their muffins. A man in a charcoal suit shifted his chair, quietly widening the distance between himself and whatever this was becoming. Dorian felt heat climb the back of his neck. Not shame, but the specific burn of a man who has watched contempt move through a room before and knows precisely how fast bystanders learn to look away. He reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the table between them. Official header, state seal, the kind of paper people recognize the shape of before they read a word. Vivian leaned forward without meaning to, her eyes tracking across the header line quickly. Too quickly. The way you read something you already know rather than something you're seeing for the first time. That's a TCEQ inspection order, Dorian said, his voice steady in a way that cost him something to maintain. Travis County. Your redevelopment corridor. This morning. He held Harlan's stare without blinking. Don't touch anything else from that counter. Not until someone pulls the camera footage from 8:57. Harlan didn't answer the timestamp. He looked at the inspection order the way a man looks at something he refuses to grant the dignity of a reaction. Then he looked at Dorian, then at the bailiff, and the message in that sequence was clear. Handle this. The bailiff cleared his throat and took another step forward, but his posture had shifted, not softer, just slower. The way a man moves when he started listening to two conversations at once and isn't sure which one is real. Dorian didn't wait for permission. He moved toward the counter with the measured pace of someone who had walked into uncomfortable rooms before and learned that hesitation only gives other people time to close doors. The bailiff fell into step beside him, which was the first small thing that went differently than Harlan expected, an escort instead of a removal. Vivian, tablet still in hand, murmured to building management and then stopped murmuring when she realized nobody in the cafe was watching Harlan anymore. The room had tilted, almost imperceptibly, toward the counter. The barista, a young woman with a name tag that read Priya, hands still holding the unused paper towels, watched Dorian approach with the expression of someone trying to decide between two versions of fear. Dorian kept his voice low enough that it didn't travel, calm enough that it didn't threaten. Did someone ask you to switch the lids this morning? He said. Did someone tell you it was for the man in the suit by the window? Her throat moved. Her eyes didn't. But they flicked, one short involuntary movement, toward the pastry case to her left, where a second employee in a half-apron had gone abruptly still, his back to the room, pretending to arrange something that didn't need arranging. People say they would step in if something felt wrong, until stepping in means standing between a billionaire and his morning routine. The bailiff had heard that kind of calculation before in his body, and he was making it now, and whatever he decided, he hadn't decided yet. Harlan's voice arrived from behind them, sharp and deliberate. You're not a cop, he said to Dorian's back. You don't get to question my staff. He gestured at Vivian with two fingers, a small, practiced motion that meant escalate, and she was already dialing. But the bailiff didn't move to pull Dorian away, and that gap, that 3-second gap where authority didn't close the scene, was enough. I'm not questioning your staff, Dorian said without turning around. I'm asking one person one question. He looked at Priya again, and this time his voice carried something that wasn't pressure. It was closer to recognition, one person who understood what it felt like to be handed something by someone with a badge and told not to ask why. You didn't know what was in it, he said quietly. Did you? Her hands shook once, a small tremor she pressed flat against the counter. She didn't speak, but the silence had a texture to it that everyone close enough to feel it understood. Harlan moved toward the counter himself now, irritation pulling him forward. This ends here, he said. He was looking at the cafe manager, a compact man in his 40s who had appeared from the back office and was standing at the edge of the scene the way people stand at the edge of something they don't want to own. Pull the camera footage, Harlan said to him, not because he believed Dorian, but because men like him prefer to win with evidence rather than just authority. Show him there's nothing there and get him out. The manager hesitated. Vivian stepped forward and pointed toward the mounted camera above the pickup counter, the one with the clearest angle on the register area. That one, she said helpfully, leaning past the manager's shoulder. That'll show the whole counter from 8:45 on. The manager nodded and reached for his tablet. Dorian watched the footage load on the small screen, and the room contracted around that image. Everyone close enough had drifted inward without realizing it. The couple from the window table, the man in the charcoal suit, the bailiff with his hand still near his belt. Harlan stood slightly apart, arms folded, composure buttoned back into place, already preparing the expression he'd, where when the screen showed nothing and Dorian had nowhere left to stand. Then a detail arrived that had nothing to do with the footage. Dorian turned slowly and looked at the table by the window, the one where the man in the charcoal suit had been sitting before he shifted his chair. It wasn't the suit that caught him. It was the table itself. One coffee cup, one chair. No receipt, no crumpled napkin, no phone left for a moment. Nothing that said a person had sat there and intended to stay. Only the chair's angle, pushed back at the specific diagonal of someone who left in a direction they'd already chosen. The man hadn't just moved. He was gone. The footage was grainy the way security cameras always are, not unwatchable, just honest, stripping everything down to shape and movement and timestamps in white digits at the bottom of the frame. The manager tilted the tablet so the small crowd around the counter could see, and for a moment nobody spoke, because the footage was doing something nobody had asked it to do. It was making the morning make sense in the wrong direction. 8:45. The counter was ordinary. Priya moved between the espresso machine and the register, the rhythm of a person in the middle of a shift they'd done 100 times. Customers arrived, ordered, waited, left. The camera caught all of it in the flat. In different ways, surveillance cameras record the world, without drama, without emphasis, without knowing what it was looking at. Then 8:57 arrived on the timestamp, and the ordinary stopped. A man in a dark jacket stepped into the frame from the left edge, not from the entrance, not from the order line, but from the space beside the pickup counter where people stand when they're waiting for a name to be called. He didn't look at the menu board. He didn't look at the register. He turned toward Priya with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how the next 30 seconds would go, and he held out one hand, palm up, presenting something small. The camera couldn't resolve it clearly, a flat disc or a folded card, and Priya's hand moved in response. Not to take the object, to move something behind the counter. A cup, already lidded, already sealed, the way cups get sealed when someone wants them to look finished. The man in the dark jacket stepped back out of frame 10 seconds after he entered it. Not rushed, not furtive, just done. Priya stood with both hands flat on the counter for a moment, very still, before the next order pulled her back into motion. Harlan watched the screen and said nothing. His jaw had tightened by a degree that might not have been visible to anyone who hadn't been watching for it, but Dorian had been watching for exactly that. The arrogance hadn't left Harlan's face. It had just been joined by something else, a calculation running behind the eyes, the look of a man totaling a number he didn't want to reach. The manager zoomed the footage back to the moment the man appeared and froze it. The face was angled slightly down, deliberate without being obvious, caught in the partial shadow of the counter awning. Enough to obscure, not enough to mean nothing. A jawline, a collar, the particular way a person stands when they've been trained to stand somewhere without being remembered. Dorian looked at Priya. She was staring at the frozen image on the tablet with both arms crossed over her chest, holding herself together at the seams. He said he was state. She said finally, voice barely above the ambient hum of the refrigeration unit behind her. He showed me something and said if I didn't do what he asked, I'd be flagged for a health code violation. She stopped. I didn't know what was in it. I thought I was helping somebody official. The room absorbed that in silence. The bailiff exhaled through his nose and shifted his weight, the small bodily adjustment of a man recategorizing a situation. The couple from the window table had drifted close enough to hear, and when the barista finished speaking, the woman turned and looked at Harlan with an expression she didn't bother to conceal. Harlan unfolded his arms. Call APD, he said to Vivian, his voice back to its controlled register. He was reclaiming the machinery of power the only way he knew how, by summoning a bigger authority than the one currently making him uncomfortable. Vivian already had her phone up. Dorian stepped back from the counter and looked again at the frozen frame on the tablet. Then he looked at the empty table by the window, then at the door. He was building a geometry in his mind. Entry point, exit route, timing, and the shape it was making was not the shape of a random act. The bailiff moved to stand beside Dorian, not to block him this time, but the way a person stands when they want to say something without announcing it. He looked down at the inspection order still sitting on Harlan's table, eyes finding the signature line at the bottom. His mouth moved once, forming a name quietly, and then his head came up. His expression had changed in the specific way expressions change when a filing cabinet somewhere in the memory opens without being asked. Hold on, the bailiff said slowly. Reddick, he looked at Dorian. You're the guy from the East Austin case. The one with the lead pipe. He stopped himself. His eyes moved to Harlan, then back. The word lead sat in the air between all of them, and nobody reached for it. Harlan's head turned toward the bailiff with the slow precision of someone who has just heard a sound they weren't prepared for. What case? He said. Not a question the way curious people ask questions. A question the way careful people ask questions, already sorting the possible answers by how dangerous each one was. The bailiff didn't repeat himself. He looked at Dorian instead, and in the pause between them something passed that had nothing to do with Harlan. A recognition between two men who had both spent time in rooms where paperwork decided people's lives. You were a field compliance tech, the bailiff said. TCQ contractor. Boggy Creek Corridor. That was you. Dorian didn't confirm it immediately. He looked at the inspection order on the table, then at the spread of dark coffee that had soaked into the grout line near the baseboard, then back at the bailiff. That was me, he said. Harlan's expression shifted in a way he didn't intend. Not recognition exactly, but recalibration, the internal machinery adjusting for a variable it hadn't budgeted for. He looked at Dorian's boots again, the drywall dust, the work shirt with its frayed collar, and the look on his face said that none of those details had changed, and they should have been enough. The word he'd used earlier, nobody, had felt accurate when he said it, the way assumptions feel accurate until the ground moves beneath them. In conference rooms, in contract cancellations, in the careful bureaucratic language of people who didn't need to raise their voices to end a career, that word had followed Dorian through every corridor of his professional unraveling. It didn't announce itself. It arrived in reformatted documents and unanswered calls and a final letter that used the phrase budgetary restructuring to describe what was, in plain terms, a removal. Because Dorian Reddick had spent 4 years walking job sites across Wilco and Hayes counties, through redevelopment corridors and post-industrial parcels in transition, documenting soil samples and water table readings and air quality baselines before cities signed off on the next profitable build. He knew what chain of custody meant because he had filled out those forms by hand, in the field, in weather, with supervisors who checked his numbers and developers who preferred different numbers. He had flagged elevated lead concentrations in a stretch of land along a redevelopment corridor near Boggy Creek, a zone that sat inconveniently adjacent to one of Harlan Wexley's most valuable land acquisitions, a parcel that needed a clean environmental review before the permits could move forward. He had written it up the way he was trained to write it up. He had watched the report get reformatted. He had watched the soil samples get retested by a secondary contractor whose findings arrived already shaped to fit the answer the project needed. And when a family in the 78721 zip code buried a 2-year-old whose blood work had been flagged and then dismissed as inconclusive and then flagged again too late, Dorian had submitted a formal objection to the revised report and been told, in language that left no fingerprints, that his contract would not be renewed. He didn't tell all of this to the café. He didn't need to. What the bailiff's 2 sentences had done was open a door in the room, and everyone standing near it could feel the air moving through from the other side. Harlan stared at him with something that had curdled past arrogance into anger, the specific anger of a man who has just understood that the person he dismissed knew exactly where to stand and why. "You fell that far," Harlan said, voice low, "and you still think you get to walk in here and lecture me?" He gestured once at the room. "You want money. You want a settlement. You want a story with your name in it. I want to know what's in the cup," Dorian said. One of the APD officers who had arrived while Harlan was speaking had already crouched near the spilled liquid with a field kit from the patrol SUV. She tore open a test strip, pressed it into the dampened napkin near the baseboard, and held it flat against the tile. The strip was white. Then it wasn't. The color that appeared was not the color of coffee. It was pale, distinct, wrong in the way that wrong things look when they've stopped pretending. She looked up at her partner without speaking, and the look between them lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "Bag the cup," her partner said quietly. Harlan's eyes moved from the strip to Dorian, and for the first time since the coffee hit the floor, he asked a question he actually needed answered. "What is today's inspection for?" he said. "Exactly." Harlan's question hung in the air without an answer because Dorian had already turned away from him, not out of disrespect, but out of the particular urgency of a man watching a clock that no one else in the room could see. He moved to the cafe's front window and looked out at East 6th Street, scanning the sidewalk with the practiced patience of someone who knew what they were waiting for and was beginning to understand what it meant that it hadn't arrived. 9:02. The morning moved outside the glass the way Austin mornings do in February. Unhurried, pale lit, the kind of cold that doesn't commit. A delivery truck idled at the curb across the street. Two students crossed against the light near the corner. A woman walked a dog that stopped to investigate a storm drain. None of them were the person Dorian was looking for, and each passing minute tightened something in his chest that had nothing to do with Harlan Wexley. The APD officer who had run the field test, Officer Renata Solis, according to the name tag Dorian had clocked when she crouched near the baseboard, stood with her partner near the counter, speaking in the low, procedural shorthand of two people who had already moved from disturbance call to something else. Her partner had bagged the cup and sealed it with a label. The cafe had been asked, politely but firmly, to stop serving. Priya stood beside the register with her hands clasped in front of her, eyes down, the posture of someone waiting to be told what the next thing would be. Harlan had repeated his question twice more, each time with less patience. Dorian finally turned from the window. "It's a redevelopment review," he said. "Wexley Holdings. The Montopolis Corridor parcels. Soil and groundwater compliance. Post-remediation verification." He let that settle. The inspector assigned was due here at 9 to review documentation before the site visit. Standard pre-visit procedure. He looked at his phone. He's 20 minutes late and not answering. Harlan's expression moved through several calculations simultaneously. "Inspectors are late," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty, the way a structure loses integrity before it loses shape. Dorian didn't respond to that. He was looking at the evidence table the officer had set up near the counter, the bagged cup, the sealed napkins, the field test strip in its evidence sleeve. Something about the cup's label had snagged his attention from the moment it was bagged, a detail so small it almost wasn't one. He stepped closer and looked without touching. The cup was a medium. The pickup label affixed to the sleeve had a name on it. Harlan's order, confirmed, but the font alignment was slightly off, the label sitting a degree crooked on the sleeve, the kind of misalignment that happened when a label printed for one cup got pressed onto a different one in a hurry. The original cup and the switched cup weren't the same size. He looked at Priya. "What size did he order?" Dorian said quietly, nodding toward Harlan. Priya's eyes moved to the bagged cup, then back. "Large," she said. Officer Solis heard that. She looked at the bag, then at Dorian, then wrote something in her notebook without being asked. The cup on the evidence table was a medium. Harlan's order had been a large. The switch hadn't been made for Harlan specifically. It had been placed near his table because his table was near the window, visible from the street, in the sight line of anyone watching from outside to confirm the scene was in motion. Whoever put that cup in play hadn't engineered it for Harlan Wexley. They'd engineered it for the morning, for the disruption, for the exact kind of procedural chaos currently filling this cafe and pulling two APD officers away from every other thing they could have been doing at 9 in the morning on an inspection day. Dorian's jaw tightened in the particular way it had been tightening since the moment he stepped through the door. Not the tightness of a man holding back anger, but the tightness of a man holding together a fear that had nothing to do with himself. He checked the street again through the window. Still nothing. He called a number he had memorized rather than stored, let it ring 8 times, and pressed end without leaving a message. Harlan watched him. Something in Dorian's stillness after the call had changed the temperature of the room in a way that Harlan's own composure, for all its years of practice, couldn't neutralize. "Who were you calling?" Harlan said. Before Dorian could answer, Officer Solis's radio crackled once from her belt. She unclipped it, stepped aside, and listened with her back to the room. When she turned around, she didn't look at Harlan. She looked at Dorian, and the look carried the specific weight of news that had already decided to be bad before anyone spoke it out loud. "There's a medical call," she said carefully. "Del Seaton. They're saying possible exposure." She paused. "The patient is a state inspector. He collapsed at his residence before leaving for a site visit this morning." Dorian's hand moved once, briefly, to his shirt pocket. The cafe had become the kind of place a crime scene becomes before anyone officially calls it one. The perimeter of normal life pushed back, the staff standing in a cluster near the pastry case. The remaining customers held at their tables by the quiet authority of Officer Solis's presence rather than any direct instruction. The espresso machine had been off for 20 minutes, and the smell of the room had shifted, the warmth of fresh coffee replaced by something cooler, more clinical, the particular atmosphere of a space that has stopped pretending to be ordinary. Harlan stood near the window with his phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. working through his contacts the way powerful men work through problems, by finding the right lever fast. But his free hand sat flat against the glass beside him, and Dorian noticed it. Not the phone call. The hand. It wasn't holding anything. It wasn't doing anything. It was just pressed against the cold glass like a man steadying himself against a surface. And in 20 years of reading rooms and people, and the small physical language of men under pressure, Dorian had learned that the hand that wasn't moving was always the one worth watching. Harlan ended the call and stayed at the window for a moment longer than he needed to, staring at the street below with an expression that had nothing arrogant in it. Just a man doing arithmetic and not liking the total. Whatever calculation he was running, it had reached a number that his status couldn't simplify. Officer Solis approached Dorian with her notebook open. "The patient Adele Seaton," she said. "They're giving a name now." She read it once, then looked up. "Calmatics." The name landed on Dorian the way a familiar weight lands when you've been bracing for it without knowing you were bracing. His jaw didn't move. His expression didn't collapse. But something behind his eyes went very still, the stillness of a man absorbing an impact he had spent 2 months trying to prevent. Calmatics had knocked on the door of Dorian's apartment in Del Valle on a Tuesday evening in December, holding a manila folder under one arm and keeping his voice below the level a 9-year-old doing homework at the kitchen table could hear. He had laid out what he knew in the quiet, careful language of a man who had been in the system long enough to understand exactly how much danger a folder like his represented. He hadn't promised Dorian anything except that the truth could still move if the right people agreed to carry it. He had left a card with a handwritten line at the bottom that Dorian had folded and placed in his shirt pocket and not thrown away. "You knew him," Harlan said from behind them. He had turned from the window. It wasn't a question. "I do," Dorian said. Present tense, deliberate. The geometry of the morning reorganized itself in that moment. Not just for Dorian, but visibly, incrementally, for everyone in the room paying close enough attention. The cup hadn't been engineered for Harlan Wexley. It had been placed near his table because his table was by the window, because Harlan's presence at Café Medrano on Tuesday mornings was as predictable as a published schedule, and because a confrontation involving a billionaire, security called, officers dispatched, the procedural machinery of money and authority grinding into motion, would consume exactly the kind of response time and institutional attention that an inspector needed to be left alone and unreachable. The cafe was never the strike. It was the noise made to cover the strike. Harlan's status hadn't protected him. It had made him useful. Dorian turned to face Harlan directly. "They didn't come here for you," he said. "They came here because of you. Because your name pulls a response. Because 2 APD units and a bailiff standing in a cafe on East 6th at 9 in the morning means nobody is thinking about a man who collapsed in Del Valle before he could reach his car." He let that settle. Cal was the target. You were the reason the room looked the other way. Subscribe before the next person who sees this coming is the only one who can't prove it. Harlan's mouth opened slightly and closed again. The calculation in his eyes had shifted from damage control to something slower and more uncomfortable. The dawning weight of having been an instrument in someone else's plan without ever being asked. His hand moved toward his phone again and stopped. Not because he had no one to call. Because calling felt suddenly inadequate for the size of what he was standing inside. On the manager's tablet, still open on the counter, Officer Solis's partner had pulled a second camera angle, the exterior feed covering the side exit on the alley-facing wall. The man in the dark jacket from the 8:57 footage was there, moving at a pace that knew exactly where the blind spots were, turning once at the alley's end before disappearing into the ordinary morning of a city that had no idea what had just been set in motion inside one of its quieter intersections. He moved like someone who had walked that route before. The detective arrived 40 minutes after the first APD unit, which was fast enough to mean someone had already flagged the case as more than a disturbance call. His name was Aurelio Kraft, Financial Crimes Unit, and he moved through the cafe with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that urgency was best worn on the inside. The room he walked into had the particular stillness of a space that had been holding the same tension for too long. The overhead lights felt brighter than they should have. The refrigeration unit behind the counter hummed at a frequency that had become irritating without anyone noticing when it started, and the faint chemical edge that Dorian had smelled the moment he walked in still hadn't fully dispersed. sitting underneath the cold air like something that didn't belong. Kraft shook hands with Officer Solis, reviewed her notes standing at the counter, looked at the bagged evidence without touching it, and then turned and looked at the room the way investigators look at rooms. Not at the surfaces, but at the relationships between the surfaces. He asked Dorian for his account first. Not Harlan. Dorian. That ordering was not an accident, and everyone in the room felt it, including Harlan, whose jaw shifted once in a way that had nothing to do with what was being said and everything to do with what the asking sequence implied. Dorian walked Kraft through it in the tight, sequential language of someone who had filed reports for a living. Timestamps, observations, the chemical smell, the cup, the footage, the cup size mismatch, the inspector's name, the alley exit. No flourishes, no editorializing. Just the architecture of what had happened laid out in the order it had happened, the way a man speaks when he knows the facts are enough. Kraft wrote and listened simultaneously, a skill that looked like passivity but wasn't. When Dorian finished, Kraft turned to Harlan with the careful courtesy detectives extend to powerful men when they aren't yet sure how powerful the moment will let them be. "Mr. Wexley," he said, "I need a full accounting of your schedule coordination for today. Who knew you'd be here, at this location, at this time, and through what channel that information traveled?" Harlan answered precisely, which was its own kind of tell, the answer of a man who had already been thinking about that question before it was asked. His Tuesday morning routine at Café Medrano was known to his assistant, to his driver, and to whoever either of them had passed the information to through calendar sharing or scheduling software. Vivian, standing slightly behind Harlan's left shoulder, added a clarifying detail about the calendar system without being asked, and Kraft wrote it down without looking up. Dorian watched Vivian add that detail and said nothing. By early afternoon, the rental plate from the alley camera footage had run through the system and returned a result that arrived wearing the right clothes but carrying the wrong identification. The vehicle was registered under a corporate account in Williamson County, tied to an LLC that, on paper, provided operational logistics consulting to a range of clients whose names were arranged to obscure rather than identify. The LLC had no website. It had a registered agent in Round Rock and a mailing address that forwarded to a PMB suite. It was the kind of company that existed specifically to be the last name on a list before the list stopped. Kraft brought the plate result to Dorian and Harlan together, standing near the cafe's back wall where the noise from the street was muffled and the tile floor was cold enough to feel through the soles of Dorian's work boots. He laid it out plainly, the LLC, the shell layer, the Round Rock forwarding address. Then he said, "Someone with access to Mr. Wexley's schedule, Calmatix's inspection itinerary, and this building's layout gave a third party enough information to run a coordinated disruption across two locations simultaneously." He looked at both of them. That kind of access doesn't come from outside an organization. It comes from inside one. Harlan's eyes moved to Vivian across the room, then away, the movement quick enough to be involuntary. The word, nobody, had followed Dorian through contract cancellations and reformatted reports and a career quietly dismantled by people who never needed to say his name out loud to erase it. Now the detective was standing in front of Harlan Wexley and treating Dorian as the only person in the room speaking in verified specifics, and Harlan had nothing to call him. Not a dismissal, not a category, not a word that would hold. The costume was slipping. Dorian reached down to check his daughter's backpack at his feet, the instinctive, automatic movement of a parent who keeps physical inventory without thinking about it. His hand found the strap, rough canvas worn soft at the handle from 2 years of daily use. Found the front pocket. Found the zipper pull, the small metal toggle still warm from where her hand had last touched it that morning when she'd clipped the lanyard on before they left the apartment. His fingers stopped. The lanyard was gone. Not unclipped and dropped inside. Gone. The zipper pull was still fastened. The lanyard had been removed cleanly from a bag sitting at his feet in a public room for the better part of 2 hours. He looked up slowly and scanned the cafe. Priya behind the counter. The officers near the door. Kraft beside him. Harlan across the room. Vivian with her tablet, fingers moving across the screen, composing something. She angled away from the room, the light from the screen sharp and pale against her face. Someone in this space had been close enough to touch his daughter's name. Dorian didn't announce what he'd found. He straightened up from the backpack slowly, filed the missing lanyard behind his eyes where it would stay until he knew what to do with it, and looked at Detective Kraft with an expression that communicated urgency without theater. "I need a minute with the barista," he said quietly. Kraft studied him for 2 seconds, then nodded once. Priya was sitting on a stool behind the counter, a paper cup of water in her hands that she hadn't drunk from, the condensation tracking a slow line down the side and pooling against her fingers. She looked up when Dorian approached, and her face arranged itself into the expression of someone bracing for the next difficult thing in a morning that had been made entirely of them. Dorian leaned against the counter edge, the laminate cool and slightly sticky under his forearm, the kind of surface that absorbed a busy morning without giving anything back, and kept his voice below the room. "The man who came in at 8:57, he said, after he left the counter. "Did he go anywhere else in the cafe before he walked out?" Priya's hands tightened around the cup. Her eyes moved to the floor near the end of the counter, then back to Dorian. "He stopped," she said, "by the bags. The pickup shelf." She nodded toward the low shelf near the window where customers left their belongings while they waited for orders. "He stood there maybe 10 seconds. I thought he was checking if his order was ready." She stopped. There wasn't an order for him. Dorian looked at the shelf. It was positioned at the exact height and angle where a backpack on the floor beside the nearest table would sit within arm's reach of someone standing at it with their back to the room. He reached into his jacket, and when he straightened and placed the information quietly in front of Kraft a minute later, Kraft wrote it without expression, but he wrote it fast. Priya stood and moved to the small lost and found box mounted to the wall beside the pastry case. She reached in without looking and held out a laminated lanyard tag, the marker ink slightly smudged at one edge from being handled. The name on the back was his daughter's. Priya's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He left it on the counter after," she said. "I didn't know whose it was. I didn't know what it meant." Dorian took it from her and held it in his closed fist, the laminate warm from the lost and found box, edges sharp against his palm. The man in the dark jacket had known exactly whose bag that was. He had known Dorian's name, his daughter's name, and precisely where they would be standing on a Tuesday morning. The cafe hadn't been chosen for Harlan Wexley's coffee habit alone. It had been chosen because Dorian Reddick was going to be in it, and whoever built this morning wanted him to understand, in the most personal language available, that his world was reachable. Dorian's jaw tightened. He unclenched his fist, looked at his daughter's name one more time, and put the lanyard in his shirt pocket, next to the card Cal had left him in December. Across the room, Kraft had moved to Vivian. The conversation was quiet and professional, but Vivian's posture had changed in the way posture changes when the ground beneath a story begins to give. Kraft asked her something specific, a date, a time, a name, and her answer came half a beat too slow. Then Kraft asked something else, and she stopped answering entirely and said she needed to call her attorney. The cafe went quieter than it already was. The refrigeration unit, the only sound filling the space between that sentence and whatever came next. Harlan watched that exchange from 10 feet away and went completely still. He turned to Dorian, and for the first time since the coffee hit the floor that morning, there was nothing left in his face that resembled the man who had looked at a pair of work boots and decided he already knew everything worth knowing. He crossed the room slowly, stopped a few feet away, and stood with his hands at his sides, not confrontationally, just openly, the posture of a man who had run out of positions to take. "You knew this was coordinated before you walked in," he said. Not an accusation. A man finally asking the right question. "I knew enough," Dorian said. "Kel told me the pattern was running again. I didn't know the timing until this morning." Harlan was quiet. Outside, a second unmarked unit had pulled up to the curb, and through the glass front of the cafe Dorian could see two people in the back seat reviewing something on a screen, their faces lit blue-white in the pale February morning. Kraft stepped outside to meet them, and when he returned, the diplomatic padding was gone from his voice entirely. "Mr. Wexley," he said, "we're drafting a warrant for internal communications, scheduling, third-party security coordination, contractor correspondence, all of it, for the last 30 days. You can make that cooperative, or we can make it procedural." Harlan looked at Vivian in the corner, phone pressed to her ear, eyes on the floor, the sound of her voice too low to hear, but the shape of it unmistakably the shape of someone managing consequences rather than denying them. Something moved across Harlan's face, not shame yet, but the ground floor of it, a man beginning to feel the weight of what his empire had been doing in rooms he chose not to enter. "Cooperative," he said. "Whatever you need." The warrant moved faster than warrants usually move, which told Dorian something about how high the concern had climbed inside the system once Calmatix's name entered the official record. By late afternoon, Kraft's unit had pulled Harlan's internal communications through a cooperative disclosure that Harlan's attorneys managed with the tight-lipped efficiency of people trying to limit a fire they hadn't yet fully mapped. What the communications showed wasn't a single smoking document. It never was. It was a pattern, the kind that only becomes visible when you lay enough pages side by side under fluorescent light and stop reading each one individually. When the smell of printer toner and cold coffee fills a conference room and the clock on the wall passes midnight without anyone moving to leave. Vivian Marsh had been the bridge. Not a rogue actor operating outside her employer's knowledge, but a bridge, the person through whom Harlan's world connected to the world he preferred not to see directly. She had passed Calmatix's inspection itinerary to a contact at the logistics consultancy in Williamson County through a scheduling system that used a third-party calendar integration, the kind of innocuous-looking software gap that compliance departments miss because it doesn't announce itself as a vulnerability. She had coordinated Harlan's Tuesday morning location through the same channel without knowing, or choosing not to ask, what the information would be used for. When Kraft's team ran the consultancy's contract history, they found 4 prior engagements tied to projects where environmental review had experienced what the contracts called procedural delay events. Inspectors reassigned, documentation misfiled, site visit windows missed by hours. None of it criminal on its face. All of it consequential in practice. Kraft's team also found something inside the calendar system that nobody had asked them to look for. A recurring block on Vivian's private calendar, labeled Routing Check, that corresponded exactly to the dates of 4 prior compliance site visits across 3 different Wexley Holdings projects. Not close to the dates. The dates. Someone had been running a system for long enough that it had developed its own rhythm, its own shorthand, its own confidence that no one would ever look. The arrest came quietly, the way real arrests do. Not in the cafe, not with an audience, but in a parking structure off Congress Avenue at 6:14 in the evening, the concrete smell of the structure flat and cold. Vivian in the back seat of an unmarked unit with her attorney on the phone and her tablet already surrendered. The charges were dry in their language and devastating in their meaning. Obstruction of a regulatory process, conspiracy to interfere with a public health investigation, and a third count tied specifically to the deliberate incapacitation of a state official. The consultancy's principal was picked up in Round Rock 2 hours later. Calmatix's report, the full, unredacted version he had been carrying toward a Travis County hearing, was recovered from a secured cloud account he had set up specifically because he no longer trusted the agency's internal servers. It covered the Montopolis corridor parcels in the kind of detail that didn't leave room for reformatting. Independent lab confirmation, cross-referenced against Dorian's original flagged samples from years earlier, produced findings that the City Council's Oversight Committee could not receive and then responsibly ignore. The vote on the redevelopment approval was pulled from the agenda pending full review. Remediation conditions were entered into the official record with deadlines and a third-party monitoring requirement that couldn't be dissolved by a donation or a phone call. It wasn't poetic. It was procedural, slow, unglamorous. The kind of accountability that doesn't make for a clean story because it moves through paper rather than confrontation. But it held. And the things that hold are the only things that matter. Harlan came to find Dorian 2 days after the arrests, at a work site in Del Valle where the air smelled of cut lumber and joint compound, and the particular dry cold of a structure mid-build, open to the sky at one end where a window frame was still waiting on glass. Dorian was finishing a drywall job that had been waiting on him since Monday, and Harlan arrived without his assistant, without a driver visible at the curb, his shoes wrong for the site in a way that somehow made him look more honest than he had all morning in the cafe. He stood at the edge of the concrete slab and waited to be acknowledged rather than assuming it, which was a different posture than any he had worn on East 6th Street. He asked Dorian what he needed, not as charity, not as a transaction, but in the plain language of a man who had spent 48 hours understanding what his silence and contempt had cost someone who hadn't deserved either. Dorian told him the truth. "I need my name back," he said. I need my daughter to stop hearing the word nobody attached to her father. Harlan nodded and said it plainly, without cameras and without an audience. I underestimated you. I was wrong. The sentence didn't fix anything that had been broken, but it marked the place where something stopped. 3 days after that, Dorian received a call from a number he recognized as the agency's legal division. His original case file, the Boggy Creek flagging, the reformatted report, the contract non-renewal, had been formally reopened as part of the broader investigation. The findings he had submitted years earlier, the ones quietly buried under revised numbers and institutional pressure, were being re-entered into the evidentiary record. A paralegal used careful, measured language to explain what that meant procedurally, but what it meant plainly was this. The truth he had carried alone for years had finally found a room willing to hear it. Then she said the next part. To proceed, they needed a formal affidavit, possibly testimony, his name attached, on record, in a proceeding that would draw attention from people who had already demonstrated they were willing to reach into his life as far as his daughter's backpack. Dorian stood at the edge of the worksite with the phone against his ear, the February wind moving through the unfinished window frame and pulling sawdust across the concrete floor in a slow, dry drift, and he thought about what it cost to tell the truth when the truth had already cost you everything once before. Dorian stood at the edge of that Del Valle worksite for a long time after the call ended. The phone sat in his palm, and the February light pressed flat and gray across the rooftops, and he could hear, from the open window of the apartment 2 floors above him, the sound of a cartoon his daughter was watching. A familiar theme song, ordinary and bright. The sound of a child having a normal afternoon because her father had held things together long enough for normal to still exist. He thought about what it had cost to tell the truth the first time. The contract that didn't renew. The income that dried up in increments. The years of rebuilding a life from the foundation up, with work boots and drywall dust, and a daughter watching everything, learning what a man does when the room decides he doesn't matter. He called the number back and told the paralegal he would sign the affidavit. There was no dramatic pause before the decision. No cinematic weight dropped over the moment. It was just a man on a worksite making the only choice that let him look his daughter in the eye at dinner, which was the only metric that had ever reliably guided him when everything else got complicated. He signed the affidavit 4 days later in a downtown Austin office building, with a notary and a cup of coffee that he checked the smell of before he drank it, and the small, private irony of that was not lost on him. The proceedings that followed moved the way legal proceedings move, in increments, in filings, in scheduled hearings that got rescheduled and rescheduled again before they finally held. The consultancy's principal entered a plea that spring. Vivian Marsh's case went to trial in the fall and resulted in convictions on 2 of the 3 counts. The third-party environmental monitor assigned to the Montopolis corridor parcels submitted its first report in August, and the findings aligned closely enough with Dorian's original Boggy Creek documentation that the agency's internal review board formally acknowledged the prior report had been improperly revised. The acknowledgement was 3 paragraphs in a document that would never trend anywhere or carry anyone's name above a fold. It was also, in the specific language of institutions admitting error, the clearest form of vindication available to a man who had been called nobody while telling the truth. Cal Maddox recovered. He was discharged from Del Seaton after 11 days, still weak, still furious in the focused way of a man who had nearly been erased, and found the experience clarifying rather than defeating. He and Dorian met twice in the months that followed, once at a diner on Airport Boulevard where they went over documentation, and once at a park in southeast Austin where Cal's granddaughter was playing and Dorian's daughter was reading on a bench nearby, and the 2 men sat in lawn chairs and didn't talk about any of it for an hour, which was its own kind of necessary. Harlan Wexley's company completed the Montopolis Corridor project 18 months later, under the revised conditions, with the monitoring requirements intact and the remediation commitments funded and on schedule. Harlan didn't hold a press conference about it. He didn't attach his name to the cleanup the way powerful men sometimes attach their names to the consequences of their own systems, looking for the redemption arc their publicist can use. He just complied, and compliance, unglamorous, binding, enforceable compliance, was more than most people in his position had ever been made to offer. The last time Dorian saw him, It was outside the Travis County Courthouse, a brief and unscheduled crossing of paths on a Wednesday morning. Harlan nodded once, the kind of nod that carries more than it performs. Dorian nodded back. There was nothing left between them that required a larger language than that. What this story carries for anyone watching is not the ending of a man who won against a billionaire. Dorian Reddick didn't defeat Harlan Wexley. He simply refused to disappear when disappearing would have been easier, and he stayed precise when panic would have been understandable, and he kept standing in the specific spot where the truth required a person to stand, not because he was fearless, but because he had already lost enough to know that shrinking didn't protect you. It just left more room for the thing coming toward you. The word nobody had followed him through contract cancellations and quiet professional erasures, and a Tuesday morning in a cafe where a billionaire looked at his boots and thought he already knew the whole story. What the word never accounted for was what a person carries on the inside. The receipts, the knowledge, the years of doing the unglamorous work of paying attention. Status is loud. It fills rooms. It moves bailiffs and tilts chairs and makes bystanders study their muffins. But it cannot rewrite a fact that has already been documented. It cannot clean a sample that has already been flagged. And it cannot make a man nobody who already knows exactly who he is. If you have ever been spoken over, written off, or handed the word nobody like it was a verdict, hold your ground. The room will not always tilt your way immediately. The machinery moves slowly and the cost is real, and the people trying to erase you are often better resourced and better connected and surrounded by people who nod on command. But intimidation is a costume. Status wears it convincingly, but it only works when you agree to be dressed by it. Stand steady long enough, stay precise long enough, and the costume starts to slip, and what's underneath it is always smaller than it looked from the outside. When was the last time someone tried to make you feel small in public? And looking back, what do you wish you had done differently in that moment? Have you ever had the truth on your side but stayed quiet because the person on the other side had more power, more money, or more people nodding along with them? What did that cost you? Do you think respect is something people owe each other from the start, or something that only gets revealed under pressure? And does your answer change depending on who's in the room? If you were in Dorian's position, with a child depending on your stability and a truth that had already cost you everything once, would you have signed that affidavit? Be honest. What is one thing someone said to dismiss you that you have since proved wrong? Not for them, but for yourself.